This terrifying serial killer is attempting to be freed after 50 years in prison. In 1975, Patrick McKay was sentenced to life in prison for the murders of 2 elderly women and a Catholic priest. Isabella Griffiths, Adele Price, and Anthony Crean all died at the hands of Patrick. After being arrested, he confessed to a shocking further 8 murders, but he then retracted this and said that he'd simply said that because of mental illness. Patrick claims that he is of no threat to the general public and has a parole board meeting soon. The parole board will consider whether he is remorseful, his behaviour in prison, and the nature of his crimes.
I killed my whole family because I thought they were going to eat me. My name is Cesar Olalde. I'm 18 years old, and I was convinced that my family were cannibals. It was the end of May in the small town of Nash, Texas. Using a firearm, I took the lives of my father, mother, older sister, and 5-year-old brother, thinking they intended to eat me. The place was a bloodbath. I moved the bodies to the bathroom before calling 911, confessing to the murder of my family, and talking about ending my life. The house was obsessively barricaded, and when they arrived, law enforcement engaged in a protracted negotiation to convince me to surrender. Finally incarcerated pending indictment and trial for premeditated murder, I face charges that could carry the death penalty or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The investigators determined that there was no evidence that my family were cannibals, so I killed them for no real reason. My bail has been set at $10 million. What punishment do you think I deserve? Will you pay my $10 million bail so I can get out?
Alex Murdaugh has been found guilty of killing his wife and son, but the most bizarre part of this case is the staged shooting 3 months after their deaths. On September the 3rd, 2021, Alex resigned from his family law firm. This was after controversy over suspected theft. Now, the amount was said to have been in the millions. 3 months prior to this, Alex's wife and youngest son, Paul, had been murdered, and many people suspected Alex. We now, of course, know that Alex has been found guilty in these murders, but let's explore this random stage shooting. On September the 4th, Alex was apparently shot in the head while changing a tyre in the middle of the road. As we now know with the Murdaughs, nothing is what it seems on the surface. He told police that a truck had slowed down, shot him, and drove off. The injury was not life-threatening, and he was discharged from hospital pretty soon afterwards. 2 days later, Alex entered rehab for substance abuse. On September the 14th, police announced that Alex's former client, Curtis Smith, who had also been providing Alex with substances, had been arrested. This is for conspiring with Alex to kill him by the road so that his son Buster could make a $10 million insurance claim. Smith was charged with assisted unaliving, aggravated assault and battery, and insurance fraud. Alex Murdaugh will be sentenced today after being found guilty of killing his wife and son.
I have sexually assaulted more than 6 women during their cesarean sections and was filmed during my acts. I am Giovanni Quintella Becerra, a 32-year-old anesthesiologist from Rio de Janeiro. As an anesthesiologist, I was responsible for administering anesthesia to pregnant women and suturing cesarean wounds. One day, several nurses noticed that I was using an excessively high dosage of sedatives and that once alone behind the curtain, my behavior was very suspicious. That's why several nurses teamed up to place a camera in a showcase in the operating room to monitor my activities. While the camera was filming, on June 5, 2022, I did as I usually did and abused one of my patients. This video literally showed everything I had done to this poor woman. After the nurses viewed the footage from the hidden camera, they immediately alerted the police. Investigators then discovered that I had done this to more than 6 women, but judicial hearings are still ongoing to examine the evidence and testimonies related, as I have likely abused more than 6 women, but this has not yet been confirmed. I am currently banned from practicing medicine in Brazil and am in jail, awaiting my final judgment.
This Russian model flew on Jeffrey Epstein's private plane and then jumped from her balcony to her death. This model's death we're just finding out is connected to Jeffrey Epstein, so let's talk about it. This is crazy. This is Ruslana Korshanova. She was a very, very famous model from Russia, and when she was 18 years old, as it was recently revealed, she took a trip on the Lolita Express. And as it was revealed in the documents, she was flown on the Lolita Express to Jeffrey Epstein's private island. Now, God only knows what happened to her while she was on that island, or matter of fact, while she was on that plane, but we now know that she took that flight on June 7th, 2006. And almost 2 years exactly to the day after she took that trip on that plane, she took her own life. When Ruslana was only 20 years old, she cut a hole in the metal mesh that was surrounding her apartment building. She crawled through it and plummeted 9 stories to her death. Now, this news story was already shocking, and people were talking about how this very young, very beautiful model had taken her own life in one of America's most bustling cities. She had a promising career ahead of her. Why did she do this? While the reasoning is still unknown, there's so much more to the story that I feel like we just don't know. It's obviously making a lot of people question what happened to her on the plane, what happened to her on the island, how much that affected her adult life. I mean, within 2 years after this plane flight, she was dead. And it's still unknown, as people are reporting, exactly how she came in contact with Jeffrey Epstein and why she was on the flight, why she was on his island. I'm sure we're going to find out some more in this situation, but yeah, something just seems fishy here.
When this woman went missing, her boyfriend Paul did a TV interview which caused a lot of people to suspect that he'd killed her. Joanne Nelson was reported missing by her boyfriend Paul Dyson on the 15th of February 2005. Joanne was a well-liked woman who had seemingly vanished from her home in Hull without a trace. Her partner Paul said that it was completely out of character for her to disappear and said that he had found her car unlocked. Paul seemed distraught to onlookers who were trying to help him find Joanne. He claimed that he was at work when she vanished and that he simply did not know where she'd gone. He said that they were going to get married in the future and that there were no issues within the relationship. However, Paul was captured on CCTV the day before her disappearance buying bin bags and cleaning products. Paul agreed to do a TV interview and claimed that he wanted Joanne to come back. He was screwing his face up and seemed to be very distressed. Despite his tears on camera, however, the public was suspicious. Observant viewers noticed that he seemed to have marks on his hand. It's not unusual for victims of strangulation to try and claw at the perpetrator's hands in order to try and get them to release their grip. As police started to investigate Paul, dark details from his past emerged. His ex-wife had been knocked unconscious by Paul, and he'd even choked her to the point where she passed out. Interestingly, Paul's own dad was a killer as well. He had stabbed someone to death and was also involved in a fatal car accident. Paul was eventually caught when his mum reported to police that he'd confided in a close friend to killing Joanne. He admitted to strangling her in an argument over housework. He had wrapped her in bin bags and driven her body for miles. He was jailed for life in 2005 but has shockingly now been released. He served just over 17 years in prison.
This is by far one of the worst ways somebody has ever died, and whatever you do, don't look up the picture. This was 35-year-old Jill Greninger, and she was employed at Economy Locker Storage Company that was in Muncie Township, Pennsylvania. And inside of this factory, they had a bunch of industrial-sized meat grinders. The meat grinder that was involved in this story, I don't know exactly what style it was, but every single picture I pull up has this type of design. On April 22nd, 2019, Jill Greninger was inside of the factory hard at work. And what unfolded next, nobody is 100% sure about. There weren't any cameras that saw it happen, and there weren't any human witnesses that saw it happen. Jill was on top of a rolling ladder above one of the meat grinders, and they either speculate that a piece of her clothing got caught in the blades, or she simply just slipped and fell into it. Regardless of how it happened, Jill fell into the meat grinder. She would fall headfirst into a bladed system like this. Another employee inside of the building heard some sort of horrific sounds coming from one of the machines. The coworker then went over and noticed that Jill fell into the meat grinder. Since Jill fell into the meat grinder headfirst, the coroner believes that she hopefully died almost instantly. The head portion of Jill's body was basically gone. After this incident, the factory was investigated, and they found 11 serious violations inside that factory, and because of these violations, the company was fined $49,000. This death is just so awful because can you imagine how terrifying those first few seconds were for Jill when she fell into the meat grinder? I also find it weird how the fine was so low, especially when these safety issues resulted in a death. But nonetheless, this death is absolutely awful, and may Jill Greninger rest in peace.
When this woman went missing, her boyfriend Paul did a TV interview which caused a lot of people to suspect that he'd killed her. Joanne Nelson was reported missing by her boyfriend Paul Dyson on the 15th of February 2005. Joanne was a well-liked woman who had seemingly vanished from her home in Hull without a trace. Her partner Paul said that it was completely out of character for her to disappear and said that he had found her car unlocked. Paul seemed distraught to onlookers who were trying to help him find Joanne. He claimed that he was at work when she vanished and that he simply did not know where she'd gone. He said that they were going to get married in the future and that there were no issues within the relationship. However, Paul was captured on CCTV the day before her disappearance buying bin bags and cleaning products. Paul agreed to do a TV interview and claimed that he wanted Joanne to come back. He was screwing his face up and seemed to be very distressed. Despite his tears on camera, however, the public was suspicious. Observant viewers noticed that he seemed to have marks on his hand. It's not unusual for victims of strangulation to try and claw at the perpetrator's hands in order to try and get them to release their grip. As police started to investigate Paul, dark details from his past emerged. His ex-wife had been knocked unconscious by Paul, and he'd even choked her to the point where she passed out. Interestingly, Paul's own dad was a killer as well. He had stabbed someone to death and was also involved in a fatal car accident. Paul was eventually caught when his mum reported to police that he'd confided in a close friend to killing Joanne. He admitted to strangling her in an argument over housework. He had wrapped her in bin bags and driven her body for miles. He was jailed for life in 2005 but has shockingly now been released. He served just over 17 years in prison.
This disturbing video has been shocking people for years. This video is about a woman named Nikki who becomes possessed by a ghost while doing a makeup tutorial. The video begins with Nikki normally introducing herself and her makeup tutorial. However, a little bit into the tutorial, the left side of the screen changes and Nikki immediately starts staring directly into the camera. And at this point, it gets extremely disturbing. Nikki then starts banging her head against the table and blood splatters everywhere. After this, she sits in the chair dead still with a swollen face and one eye twitching, while a lot of blood pours down her face. This video is meant to be a horror story, and it is very effective at creating a sense of suspense and dread. The use of close-ups and sudden changes in the video are particularly effective at making the viewer feel uncomfortable. The video also plays on the viewer's fear of the unknown, as it never fully explains what happened to Nikki or why she becomes possessed. This video has been praised by some for its originality and its ability to scare viewers. However, it has also been criticized for its graphic violence and its potential trigger to viewers with mental health problems. The video is just a work of fiction. It is an acting performance that is meant to be scary and suspenseful. It is not a real depiction of a woman being possessed by a ghost, but the video is so realistic it sends chills down your spine. Now, when I first watched this video, I thought it was 100% real and I didn't know it was fake. The video is so realistic that if you go into it thinking that it's real, you're going to believe it 100%. Many people still believe this video to be real, but it has been proven to be fake. Either way, it's still an extremely hard watch just because it's blunt force trauma and she's doing it to herself. And the way she looks after she bangs her head on the table multiple times is absolutely stomach-turning. Still, I don't recommend watching this video, but if you do, I'm just warning you right now, it is pretty disturbing.
Actor Steven Seagal is supposedly one of the biggest creeps in Hollywood history. Let's take a look at some of the disturbing allegations that have been made about him over the years. So Steven Seagal really does everything. He's a musician, he's a black belt, he used to run a dojo, he's an actor, and at one point he even became a sheriff's deputy in Arizona. Yes, that happened in real life. Steven Seagal was a A-list actor in the 80s and 90s. He was all over Hollywood. But all these allegations really began in the early 1990s. So in May of 1991, 3 women come forward and accuse Steven Seagal of sexual harassment. Then at around the same time, 4 more women come forward and state that Steven Seagal acted creepily towards them and made sexual advances during late-night casting sessions. In 1995, another lawsuit was filed against Steven Seagal for discrimination and harassment, but this lawsuit was dismissed ultimately. Then, in 2010, over a decade later, more disturbing charges came forward. This time, a lawsuit was filed in Los Angeles accusing Steven Seagal of sexual harassment, wrongful termination for a job, and basically participating in human sex trafficking. Stephen, of course, denied these allegations, and eventually they were mysteriously dropped with nothing further coming out about them. Then, in 2017, things got really bad for Stephen. First, Ellen DeGeneres' wife, Portia de Rossi, came forward and stated that Steven Seagal had sexually harassed her during an audition. Then, during an appearance on Jimmy Kimmel Live, actress Katherine Heigl stated that she too had been sexually harassed by Steven. She even stated that Steven had claimed he had a 16-year-old girlfriend back when he was harassing her. And later that year, a model came forward on Instagram and stated that Steven Seagal had sexually assaulted her years ago. Then in 2018, an actress named Rachel Grant came forward and said that in the year 2002, Steven Seagal had, yes, sexually. So yeah, over the years, Steven Seagal has been accused of doing a number of horrific things. There's also the way that he's treated people that worked on his movies, altercations he's gotten into, legal decisions that were made against him by the government, fraud, all of that. It's a crazy story, but yeah, I think he's definitely guilty of doing a number of these things, and it's crazy that he never faced any sort of legal ramifications.
His MI6 agent was found dead inside a locked duffel bag. Gareth Williams was born in Wales and studied maths at Bangor University. He ended up doing a PhD at Manchester University, and in 2001 he started working for the government. This was a job in security based in Cheltenham. At the time of his death, he was actually working for MI6 in London and had obviously had to keep his job very private. On August the 16th, 2010, he failed to show up to a work meeting he was supposed to attend. His colleagues noticed his absence and eventually reported him missing days later. Police went to his house to try and find him and noticed that the heating was turned up full blast. When they were inside the bathroom, they noticed a large, suspicious red duffel bag in the bath. There was a padlock on the outside and it was obviously full of something. When police managed to get the bag open, they found Gareth's body. Police found no fingerprints on the bag or bath and nothing was missing from Gareth's home. At first, his death was classed as suspicious and unexplained, and there were no injuries on his body or signs of any substances. Professionals actually attempted to try and lock themselves in the duffel bag to see if it was possible, but they failed to do so after about 400 attempts. It was concluded that it was impossible for Gareth to have actually locked himself inside the bag. Personally, I feel like that would be kind of obvious. There were some suspicious factors relating to the investigation, such as the Secret Intelligence Service keeping some evidence to themselves. Also, the methods that they used to interview Gareth's co-workers were deemed as strange. The coroner stated that Gareth was killed unlawfully, and the coroner criticised the SIS for not reporting him missing for a whole week. This is when police started releasing information to the media about questionable websites that Gareth had visited. They tried to suggest that maybe being tied up was something Gareth was into, and perhaps he did this to himself. The coroner believed that this was part of a media manipulation attempt. The coroner said that the possible involvement of SIS staff in the death was a legitimate line of inquiry for the police. This prompted a reinvestigation by the Met Police, which lasted a year, and the outcome is shocking. They concluded that the most probable scenario was that he had died alone in his flat after accidentally locking himself inside of the bag.
Whatever you're doing, stop scrolling. You have to see this video. This story was posted by Brilliant Bex 1992 on Reddit. It's called The Whistling Follower. When I was 16, I was in a choir at my high school that performed for a lot of different events around town. One of them was to sing at the middle school sporting events. The middle school in my hometown is just about a half mile from my childhood home, so whenever we had events there, I walked, because I didn't get my license until I was 17. This one night, I think it was November, we had to sing at a basketball game, and it was obviously dark. Normally, I wasn't allowed to walk alone at night, but for choir, I was given permission unless I felt unsafe. But there wasn't any reason to be creeped out at first, so I started my walk, alone. Just down from the middle school is a stretch of road with almost no streetlights. That has always creeped me out when walking. I crossed quickly and had a fast pace going, as I'm a naturally paranoid person. About 2 minutes into the dark zone of the street, I heard rapid footsteps coming up from behind me. I at first figured it was a jogger, but they made no attempt to pass me and just stayed a comfortable 10 feet distance from me. Then, the creepiest part, they began whistling a jaunty tune, which I at first thought was funny. At this point I wasn't super scared, perhaps because of the happy whistling tune. But I noticed that the footsteps behind me started to speed up. There were no cars on the road, and given the lack of a light, when I turned around, all I could see was a silhouette that was shrouded in darkness. At that realization, I quickened my pace to barely under a run. The whistling continued, getting more breathless as this person began to run after me. I looked back to see a dark figure coming at me full speed, and in terror, I began to run frantically. I will never forget those last moments, running through that dark subdivision, hearing his whistling and footsteps getting closer and closer. This person followed me up to my door. I ran inside and locked the front door. I checked all the other doors and went to my upstairs bedroom. From the window, I could still see a silhouette and still hear him whistling. I slept with my knife that night.
Imagine getting stuck in your own house and dying. Well, this is one of the worst deaths imaginable, explained. This is 38-year-old Mariessa Weber, who lived in Florida. She was a very petite person who was 5'3" and just under 100 pounds. On the evening of October 28, 2006, Mariessa would return home, say hello to her mother, and then go into her room like she always does. But then she was never seen again. The next morning, her mother realized she was gone, and her sister didn't hear from her. Nobody that she knew seen her or heard from her either. They searched the entire house and even her bedroom, but they didn't find her. So she was then reported as missing to the police department. People were thinking maybe she got kidnapped, maybe she fell into the wrong crowd. The issue with that was there was no forced entry into the home. There were no signs of forced entry into her bedroom. There was no signs of altercation that took place. It's literally as if she just vanished into thin air. A couple days would go by and the mother and sister would start to smell very bad smells throughout the house. They blamed this on rats that might have gotten stuck in the walls and died. Several more days would pass and the smell would keep getting worse and worse. The sister then goes into Mariessa's room once more and begins to look around, when she suddenly noticed something strange behind the bookshelf. Towards the higher part of the shelf, she noticed something that appeared to look like a human toe. The smell got worse as she approached the bookshelf, and she then looked behind it, and she then noticed her sister. Mariessa was hanging upside down from this bookshelf, and she was dead. Mariessa never left the house. She wasn't missing. For 12 whole days, she was stuck behind a bookshelf hanging upside down. It was determined that she was died from positional asphyxiation, which is when your body is upside down and it's not getting the oxygen it needs, and all of the blood is rushing towards your head and you eventually pass out. Now, nobody knows how long she was alive while she was in this position. Some people have lost consciousness between 40 and 60 seconds in this position, and some people have been able to stay in that position for hours before they were rescued or before they died. But at least for a few minutes, Mariessa was in extreme pain, and she was probably calling for help, but somehow in some way, nobody heard her. This death is something straight out of a nightmare, and may Mariessa Weber rest in peace.
A missing North Carolina teenager was just found hidden under a trap door in this man's home in a completely different state, and what he has to say about it is horrifying.
She hid on her own free will. She was actually in the bed when the officers first come in there. Her grandma kicked her out. She didn't appear to be that age. She had all kinds of piercings.
In December, a 16-year-old girl left her grandparents' home in North Carolina after a fight and disappeared. She was officially reported missing on December 6th, and her grandparents feared the worst. But what they didn't know was that 3 weeks prior to her disappearance, a 34-year-old man named Zachary Jones found the girl online and started talking to her. And he actually lured her from her home after the fight with her grandparents. Zachary then drove the girl all the way back to his home in Lincoln County, Kentucky, where he repeatedly sexually assaulted her and gave her drugs. Fast forward to Christmas Day. Zachary's mom called 911 to report a domestic violence incident between Zachary and who she thought was his girlfriend. And when police arrived at the home, he said the girl was not there. He was quickly cuffed and placed in the back of a cop car after authorities found drugs in the home. And when they went back inside to search for the girl, they found something incredibly disturbing. Locked inside of a trap door hidden under a rug in Zachary's bedroom was a young girl who authorities say appeared very high. After investigating, the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office realized that the young girl was reported missing nearly a month prior out of North Carolina. According to the girl, whose name has not been released, she said that Zachary initially told her that he was 19 online, but when she met up with him in North Carolina, he looked much older. It was there that he said he was 25, and it wasn't until they got all the way back to his home that she found out that he was actually 34. The girl said that Zachary was always armed with a gun and that he forced her to tell his family that she was 18. He also threatened to kill her many times and proceeded to sexually assault her and give her drugs. Sometimes sometimes even strangling her during the assaults. When the girl was rescued, Zachary denied choking her and said that she hid in the trap door on her own free will. But the girl had very visible marks on her neck that proved otherwise. The victim also said that on their drive back to his house, they were pulled over by a cop, and Zachary told her that he would shoot the officer if they were asked to get out of the car. Zachary was arrested and is being held at the Pulaski County Jail, while the girl was taken to the hospital for treatment and was reunited with her grandparents. In an interview from jail, Zachary admitted to all of it, but said that she told him that she was 18. He said that she didn't look to be 16 as she had all sorts of piercings, and that he was helping her after her grandparents kicked her out, which was not true. Zachary is facing 30 different charges in just Kentucky, but he's also facing more charges in North Carolina as well. He's being held without bond, and judging by his lack of remorse, I truly hope that he never gets out, because this story is absolutely terrifying.
This is the oven incident, one of the worst ways somebody has ever died, explained. This takes place in England at a company called Piranha. This company makes plastic kayaks. This is Alan Catterall, and he worked for Piranha for 12 years. But that would come to a tragic end on December 23, 2010. An employee named Mark Francis noticed there was a technical issue with this oven right here. Now, Mark Francis happens to be the man who's marrying Alan Catterall's daughter. Mark shut off the power to the oven for about an hour. He climbed into the oven even though it was still a little hot, and he noticed there was a problem with one of the ball bearings. He fixed it and it was all good to go. He then powered the oven back on. But roughly 10 to 15 minutes later, they noticed smoke pouring out of the oven, which isn't normal. And when they opened the oven doors, they saw the burnt and deceased body of Alan Catterall. You see, Alan would go into the oven, which is something he would do all the time. He went in there with a scraping machine to scrape off some of the melted plastic. Now, Mark Francis never saw him go into the oven. So when Mark Francis powered the oven back on, there is a mechanism that shuts the doors automatically. And this is exactly what happened. Now, after they found Alan, they were able to tell that he was trying to use his scraping tool, or a crowbar, to pry open the doors. And if he was screaming for help, there was no way anybody would have heard him because the machinery inside of the building is very loud. So for at least 10 minutes, Alan was being cooked and burnt alive. There was no escape latch built into the oven. There was nowhere to go, nobody heard him screaming. The doors were too heavy for him to open with the crowbar, so he had to burn alive for 10 whole minutes. They found him with extreme burns all over his body, but he eventually died from shock. If you're wondering how hot it was inside of the oven, well, it was 536 degrees Fahrenheit. Mark Francis would go on to say that he was never fully trained on how to operate the oven, and that he was never told any safety procedures. Alan's daughter would completely forgive Mark Francis for what happened. She said that she knows it was not his fault and it was the fault of the company's. And Alan's daughter still married Mark Francis. The company was then charged with corporate manslaughter. Peter Mackert, who was the director of the company, was found guilty, and he was then fined £200,000. Rest in peace to Alan Catterall, and this death is just awful.
Scrolling. You have to see this video. This was posted by Reddit user Blonde in the Woods, and this video supposedly captures the ghost of a child. Watch this. A little backstory to that is that apparently her husband's best friend used to live in the house in the video, and then eventually he started capturing weird orbs on video, and he always felt like something was off about that house. He later ended up getting a divorce from his wife and he sold the house, but a couple of months later a new couple moved in. Somehow they got in contact with the husband that just moved out and sent him this video that they supposedly captured in their living room. And the strangest thing about this is that the family moved in that captured this video that you just saw doesn't have any kids or any pets. So whatever it was definitely not them, since they weren't even home at the time.
This man was about to commit the most profoundly disturbing crime I think I've ever read about before he was arrested. This is 49-year-old Dennis Allen Gall, and he was arrested in December of 2023 for something extremely heinous. In November of 2023, Dennis began communicating with somebody on the app Telegram. Somebody who, at the time, he believed could help him arrange an encounter with a 10-month-old child. Now, this person that Dennis was communicating with was an FBI agent, but still, what he told this agent was extremely disturbing. According to the arrest affidavit, David told the FBI agent that his age of attraction was from 0 to 12 years old, but that his potential victim could be older if look younger. At one point, the FBI agent mentioned to Dennis that he might be able to set up a session with a 10-month-old baby boy. The agent then told Dennis that he's based in Tennessee, and Dennis responded, "I might have to make a trip to Tennessee very soon." They then exchanged phone numbers, and almost immediately Dennis began hitting up the agent trying to set up this disturbing encounter. When agents looked up Dennis's phone number, they discovered something disturbing. Dennis had actually been previously convicted of molesting a child he babysat in the year 2000. According to the FBI agent, in his chats, Dennis had actually mentioned that he had previously molested 3 young boys. And he stated that it all started out with his 2-year-old nephew, who he molested for a period of 3 years before being caught. So on November 20th, 2023, Dennis asked the FBI agent what part of Tennessee he was in. He replied Chattanooga. And Dennis then stated to the agent that he was planning on taking a birthday trip to come do this. He even told the agent when he talked about the session with the 10-month-old that he had just set up, this is a direct quote, "That sounds awesome. I can't wait. This is looking to be the best trip I've ever taken." Thinking quickly and becoming eager, Dennis then booked 2 rooms at the Hotel Chalet in Chattanooga, Tennessee. This is a really nice hotel, and after booking the rooms, Dennis sent the FBI agent the booking confirmation. He was assuming that this person he was chatting with was then going to bring a 10-month-old boy to the hotel so that he could do whatever he wanted to him. Disturbingly, on December 5th of last month, Dennis sent the FBI agent some creepy images. The image was of 5 infant outfits for a baby that Dennis had purchased along with an elephant rattle. It seems like he was getting ready for this session he was booking. Thankfully, though, when the day finally came and Dennis was supposed to meet up with this person to take possession of this 10-month-old boy, instead of a trafficker, Dennis met the police, and he was arrested at the Hotel Chalet and taken into custody on his 49th birthday. It's just eerie to think that people are like this and that they exist everywhere, especially here in America, and that you never really know somebody because who knows what they're doing on the deep, dark web. I'm really hoping, though, that this guy doesn't see the light of day for a very long time, and I hope his prison experience is terrible.
Doesn't it just infuriate you when people have children, especially multiple children, and then don't look after them properly? What kind of mother leaves a 5-year-old in charge of their 3 younger siblings? This beautiful baby girl, who was only 19 months old, paid the price with her life when her mother did just that. Back in 2015, Raquel Thompson lived in Texas with her boyfriend of 10 months, Cornell Malone. In the apartment also lived Raquel's 4 children, a 5-year-old, 2 3-year-olds, and a 19-month-old baby girl. She was also pregnant with Cornell's baby. According to neighbours, she would often leave the children alone, the eldest only being 5 years old, to run errands, pick groceries up, and visit family members. On this particular night, she left the children alone twice. Once to go and pick Cornell up from work, and then again while they went out for pizza and to visit Cornell's brother. It was late at night and they were gone for around 2 hours. Just a quick trigger warning here, what happens next is just absolutely horrific. They'd left the 4 children in bed fast asleep, probably expecting them to stay that way until they got back. But they didn't. They woke up. And the 2 3-year-olds decided to play a game with their baby sister, in which they put her inside the oven. The oven was turned up full with Jazira inside. Her brother and sister eventually told police that she'd been kicking the door to try and get out, and it tipped the oven over. By the time Raquel and Cornell got home, the other 3 children were hysterical. They were crying and pointing towards the kitchen. When they walked in there, they saw the oven on the floor. Cornell picked it up and Jazira's body fell out of the oven. She was completely burnt and nothing could be done to save her life. Obviously, this was a tragic accident and no charges were brought against the children, clearly, because they were 3 years old and they didn't know any better. But charges were brought against Raquel. She left those children home alone multiple times. Like, this wasn't the first time she'd done it. She must have known the dangers of leaving 4 young children alone in an apartment with free reign of the whole place, no baby gates. They had full access to the kitchen. From what I can find out online, Cornell didn't receive any charges, but Raquel received 12 years in prison. What she was charged with wasn't endangering a child. From what I can see, she got charged with abandoning a child under the age of 15, and that's what got her the 12-year sentence. No suitable relatives could be found for the other 4 children straight away, so they were placed into foster care temporarily. The father of the 2 3-year-olds did come forwards, and I have no idea whether they are now in his care, but he also said that he didn't know whether he was the father to Jazira because Raquel had refused to do a paternity test, and he didn't know where she was anyway. I just really hope those 3 children don't remember any of this when they're older, because how traumatising would that be? I hope that they're now safe and in the care of someone who is actually going to look after them.
Something that doesn't sit right with me is the interview with Jeffrey Epstein's former driver and bodyguard. And this is absolutely crazy. I'm going to show you some receipts. So this is Igor Zinoviev. He was a former UFC fighter, a really tough guy. And at some point in his career, he became Jeffrey Epstein's personal bodyguard. And for years, there have been rumors, remember these are all allegations, that he was the bodyguard that would scare some of the girls that Jeffrey Epstein was trafficking into staying silent and basically doing what they were told. So a few years ago in 2019, this interview came out with Igor, and he's basically being asked all these questions about Jeffrey Epstein. Let's talk about it. So this is all a recorded interview. So Igor isn't a native English speaker, so some of his English is a bit broken, but right here, the interview is basically just saying you were an MMA fighter and then confirming that he was Jeffrey Epstein's driver and his bodyguard and his personal trainer. The interviewer then confirms that Igor lived in Jeffrey Epstein's house, he flew on the Lolita Express, and he was with Jeffrey Epstein 24/7, which means that he more than likely saw some of the elements of the sex trafficking operation. And then this interview gets into some murky water. So in an interview in 2015, Igor was talking about all these allegations about the teenage girls that Jeffrey Epstein was hanging around. But then in 2019, when this reporter talked to him after Epstein was killed, he backtracked all of his comments. I don't know if he was afraid or if he didn't want to implicate himself. But basically, I'm going to read you this. The reporter asked, in our conversation in 2015, he described his relationship with teenage girls. So many times I try to stop him. I try to tell him my opinion about that. He don't listen to me. That's the reason why I'm not working for him no more. I make him do that to let me go. Do you remember saying that? And then he basically tries to backtrack and say, no, I never saw teenage girls around Epstein. But in 2015, he clearly was talking about teenage girls. And then the reporter keeps grilling Igor. They say, here's another thing you said last time about Epstein and the girls you saw at his house, specifically about moments when you were trying to offer him advice about his conduct. Sometimes he tries to make a joke. He'd say, thank you, Grandma, I don't need your opinion. So when you tried to do something good, he would try to make a joke in front of his girls. I never give anyone any questions. It's one of my rules, actually. I be honest with you. I never ask any of my clients what they do for a living or how they do whatever they do. I just do my job and that's it. And then they ask, do you remember saying that? To which he replies, yeah, I said that, and he tried to warn Jeffrey Epstein about the cops being on his trail. He also tried to state that he just never asks any of his employers questions. He just kind of blindly works for people, which would actually serve to clear him of any wrongdoing because he was working around the sex trafficking ring. He was basically saying, oh yeah, I never asked about it, so I wasn't involved at all. I do find it interesting, though, that he does acknowledge the girls. And here's another quote that he denied. Here's another quote from our last interview. Here's what Igor said. He had a couple girlfriends. They have no idea the degree of what they are doing, but you can't tell nothing to them because they support him kind of. For the while, this one girl can be more attached to him. He just fire her. Fire them and keep them away. For example, I give you some idea. You have private plane and you have 3 girlfriends and one girl can be more attached to him. And next week, he don't take that girl. He takes another one and he just switch them. He brings them on couple trips and then get different girls. That's what he's doing. And then they ask, sorry about that. Then they ask, do you remember that? And he says, no, I don't remember saying that. But basically what he's saying here is that he was there for all of the sex trafficking, the girls being on the plane, the girls being switched out constantly. And this interview just gets worse and worse. And basically, like, the interviewer says, like, I know that you don't want to confirm this. I know that it's sensitive. But when he tries to kind of backtrack, they say, I'll send you the receipts. I have your exact quotes. But it's when he starts to talk about Epstein taking his own life or his belief that he didn't, that's when this interview gets dark and disturbing. I'm going to make a part 2, so make sure you follow if you want to hear what he had to say. It's pretty crazy.
I think a lot of us by now will have seen over the last few days this face dominating TikTok. This is Jeffrey Epstein, and documents from court that were previously sealed have now been revealed. But I don't think it's what a lot of people were expecting. I think people were expecting an actual list of names, like a list of celebrities that have abused children on Jeffrey Epstein's island. And that's not what it is at all. There are over 1,000 names in these court documents, and just because a name is on there, it doesn't mean that they had anything to do with the abuse on the island, or that they knew anything about it. There are people like Cameron Diaz, Leonardo DiCaprio, magician David Copperfield, Michael Jackson, just to name a few. And just because they are on that list, it does not mean that they took part in the abuse on the island or that they knew anything about it. One of the victims, for example, Virginia Giuffre, named a lot of these celebrities in court. She accused Ghislaine Maxwell, who was Epstein's girlfriend at the time, of facilitating her abuse on the island. She's named anyone that she thinks might have information, might have known about the abuse, and they obviously are now part of this list. A woman called Johanna Schoberg is another one of Epstein's victims. She is the one that actually accused Prince Andrew of abusing her on the Epstein Island. She dominates a lot of the court documents, and obviously anybody that she's mentioned in relation to Epstein is on that list. Flight logs have also been released. I've managed to get my hands on them and had a read through, although it's really, really long. They date back to 1995 and show every single flight on Jeffrey Epstein's private jets. An interesting one on there is Bill Clinton. He's always denied any wrongdoing and said that he's never ever visited Epstein Island, which might be true because these flight logs don't prove that these people ever went to the island. Epstein's lawyer, for example, is on there and he flew all the time on Epstein's planes, but there's no proof that he ever went to the island. So for everybody accusing people, all the celebrities on these lists, of being part of the abuse, I think is really, really unfair. Don't get me wrong, obviously a lot of people on that list will be guilty. What went down on Epstein Island is sickening. He would fly in these underage girls with the promise of a job on a luxury island, which is what it was. But they had no idea that when they got there, they'd be completely trapped. He even tried to get a 15-year-old emancipated from her parents and asked her to move in with him. He had a staff of around 70 people and they were sworn to absolute secrecy. When he bought Epstein Island, he completely destroyed all the vegetation and he planted 40-foot palm trees around the whole island. If that doesn't scream somebody that wants to be hidden, then I don't know what does. People that worked for him said that these girls would walk around topless, some completely naked, and some of them were as young as 14. This is an island that Epstein was in full control of. It was his island, he owned it. It's not like these girls could just run down the street and go to the police. There were none. So in my opinion, anyone that's been to that island probably knew about the abuse. They'll have seen these underage girls. Even if they didn't take part in the abuse themselves, they'll have known something was going on. But the lists that are going around the internet at the moment are very misleading. Just because their names have been seen in these court documents, it doesn't mean that they went to the island. I honestly can't see anything coming out of this because nobody can prove that even if they did go to this island, nobody can prove that they took part in the abuse. I hope Epstein's victims do get some sort of closure, but I have no idea what that closure is going to look like.
The interview that Jeffrey Epstein's former bodyguard did with the reporter is insane. This is part 2, and this is where it gets really dark and juicy. So in part 1 of this interview, Igor, Jeffrey Epstein's former bodyguard, was basically admitting that he saw the girls that Epstein was trafficking and saying that he interacted with them, but he was playing dumb and saying that he didn't know what was going on. And even in this quote, the interviewer states that when she asked him about Epstein being exposed for messing with teenage girls, he said, "I'm not surprised at all. I'm just surprised how low he can be outside the real world. Someday is going to call him and it will be real jail. He have so much money he can pay it off. Me personally, if I caught him with my daughter or something do that, I'm not going to go to police. I do something else much worse. That guy could try to sue me and manipulate the situation with his money. That's the American way. I know he screwed up a lot of fashion girls also. That's a different story." Then when the reporter asks him to clarify what he meant back in 2015 before Epstein took his own life, he basically says, "Yeah, you know what, I kind of said that." And when the reporter starts saying, "I'm not making this up, I have the receipts," he's like, "I'm very careful too." Then they move into Jeffrey Epstein's death because he had just taken his own life when this interview was conducted. Basically, Igor states that he wasn't really emotional when he found out he died. And here's the exchange between Igor, the bodyguard, and the reporter. What did you think when you found that out, or that Epstein died? What did I think? Yeah. Are you sure you want to hear what I'm going to think? Yeah. Then Igor says somebody helped him to do that. The reporter asks, you think somebody helped him kill himself? Igor, the bodyguard, says, yeah. The reporter asks, okay, why? Igor, the bodyguard, says, listen, that's going a little too deep. And this is where it starts to get really freaky. So Igor basically states he lived with Jeffrey Epstein for 5 or 6 years. He had no emotion upon learning that Epstein was dead. Then he confirms a little bit more that he used to be called the mobster because he had this reputation of scaring the women that were around Jeffrey Epstein because of his imposing demeanor, which could play into the fact that people have accused him in the past of being a bodyguard for the trafficking operation. So when Igor was interviewed in 2015, he stated to the reporter that Epstein would get phone calls the night before police were set to raid his residences. This is a quote. You told me he would get phone calls the night before, and 8 o'clock the police are going to come. He would get a heads up from local police. Igor said nothing. It's silent. The reporter asks, you told me that, Igor. Want me to read the quote? Then Igor says, well, you can read whatever you want right now. You can put yourself in big trouble. The reporter then continues, you said he always do something wrong. There was some nights in question. There was at home arrest and police before they come to the house. They call him and tell him they coming in at 8 o'clock in the morning. It's all corruption, It's all bullshit. And this is where it gets scary. Igor says, listen, don't put yourself in trouble. Seriously. The reporter says, we talked about this. Igor says, I understand. We got this. The reporter then says, I'm telling you to give you a chance to remember because we talked about this stuff. I know it's hard. I don't know what you mean about put myself in trouble. And then Igor says, let that go. Seriously, let that go. The reporter then asks, why is it so important? Are you worried about the local cops? And Igor says, listen, you're really smart and I'm not going to offer that over the phone right now, okay? You're really smart. You have no idea. Please. The reporter then says, what do you mean by that? And Igor says, I can't explain you. I can't explain you over the phone any of this. And this is just incredibly dark. What is Igor talking about? What does Igor know that he cannot discuss over the phone? What connections does he know exist? The reporter then just says, you said that last time and we didn't talk for years. You can tell the world who this guy was. You were with him for a long time. You know what I mean? And Igor is silent on the phone. The reporter then says, I totally understand that you think he could have had help taking his own life. Igor then says, trying to get off the phone, first of all, I have to go right now. I have another client. The reporter says, you're still training people? Igor says, yes, but just be careful. I'm not kidding. Then the reporter says, what's your email so I can send you? And in the middle of that, Igor cuts her off and says, don't do any kind of that stuff. Just don't play it. Seriously. The reporter says, can you tell me why? And he simply says, I can't. And finally, the reporter asks one final question to Igor. He says, go ahead. They say, have you been talking to anyone in the government, the FBI? Have they come to you? Igor pauses for an extended period of time, then says, great talking to you. Seriously, we talk later. The reporter says, really? And then he says goodbye and hangs up the phone. This was the last time anybody ever heard anything that I could find online from Igor. Keep in mind, this is Igor Zinoviev. He was a former UFC fighter, a guy who was always in the spotlight. And that interview was absolutely chilling. Like I said before, what does Igor know that we don't know yet? What did he see? Who was he afraid of hearing that conversation? Why could he not tell it over the phone? Was he being tapped? Did he think the FBI was watching? Were other people watching that could have possibly taken his life for him as well? I don't really know, but there is just so much more to this story, and that one news article just does not sit right with me. There is so much in that short exchange of words that, it rubs me the wrong way. It's just gross feeling.
This little girl was kidnapped in 2018 and has just been found. On the 25th of October 2018, 4-year-old Aranza Lopez was on a supervised visit with her biological mum. Her mum, Esmeralda, was being investigated over abuse allegations, so Aranza was actually in foster care at the time. It was arranged that the pair would have a supervised visit at a Washington shopping centre. However, during the visit, Esmeralda requested to take Aranza to the toilets and used the opportunity to snatch the little girl in a stolen vehicle. The FBI were notified and a huge search for Aranza and even advertised a $10,000 reward. It wasn't until a year later that Esmeralda was found and arrested, but there was still no sign of the little girl. That was until last month. She was recovered by Mexican authorities in February in western Mexico. In 2021, Esmeralda was actually extradited back to Washington state and pled guilty to second-degree kidnapping and robbery. She was sentenced to 20 months in prison. This woman screamed, "I don't want to die," as she was dragged to her death in a horrifying theme park incident. Kelty Byrne was a Canadian student animal trainer and competitive swimmer. She was working at Sealand of the Pacific to earn extra money, and this involved being trained to work with orcas, otherwise known as killer whales. In controversial theme parks such as Sealand of the Pacific and SeaWorld, huge animals are either bred in captivity or traumatically captured and ripped apart from their families and natural habitats for humans' entertainment. On February the 20th, 1991, Kelty was working a shift and 3 whales were in one of the pools, including the infamous Tilikum. In a horrific turn of events, Kelty accidentally slipped and fell into the whale pool and attempted to grab onto the edge and save herself. However, before she could do so, she was grabbed by one of the whales that dragged her into the pool. The 3 whales then began throwing Kelty around, with many speculating that they may have simply thought this was a game. Others theorised that the whales were so traumatised and angered by their lives in tiny little pools that they took it out on Kelty. She was dragged under the water and then back up, screaming, "I don't want to die." After this horrific ordeal, she eventually drowned. It's reported that she was absolutely covered in bruises, was completely battered, and also covered in teeth marks.
This is Jared Fogle, one of the worst pedophiles in American history. So if you don't know who Jared Fogle was, he was the spokesperson for Subway for a number of years. Jared initially became famous and then eventually became the spokesman of Subway because he dropped so much weight while eating a Subway diet. According to Jared, he lost almost 245 pounds while eating almost exclusively from Subway. Obviously, this was a huge story, and when Subway heard about this, they contacted Jared and eventually made him the spokesman for their entire company. I swear to God, I remember this. For years, you couldn't turn on the TV without seeing this guy's face. So in 2004, when Jared was at the height of his popularity, he launched the Jared Foundation, a foundation determined to fight childhood obesity. This foundation saw Jared touring schools across the nation, talking to kids about losing weight, and yeah, just being heavily involved with children, which people at the time thought was a great thing. But it was when he was away from the cameras, behind the scenes, when Jared was engaging in some of the most deplorable behavior I've ever read about. So in 2007, a radio host and journalist from Florida came forward to the FBI and reported that Jared was saying and doing some concerning things. Apparently, while at a middle school event, Jared had been talking to her about performing lewd acts on a minor. He had texted her about all of these things, and she even recorded him saying all of this stuff. At one point, apparently, Jared even asked this journalist if she could install webcams in her children's bedrooms so he could watch them. Obviously, this was concerning. This journalist recorded all of this, turned it into the FBI, but they told her that they couldn't do anything because they didn't have enough evidence. And now we got to talk about Russell Taylor, a guy who was heavily involved in Jared's foundation. So when he wasn't working on the Children's Foundation, this guy, Russell Taylor, was producing CP in his home. Apparently, between the years 2011 and 2015, Russell Taylor had videotaped minors in his own home and traded photographs of them with none other than, you guessed it, Jared Fogle, king of the footlong. According to court documents, Jared actually asked Russell if he could move some of the nanny cams in his home so he could watch children in varying states of undress or while they were naked taking a bath. Russell also claimed that Jared made him set up accounts on porn sites in his name, and he wanted to basically run his whole CP operation for him. Well, shortly after Russell Taylor was arrested, Jared Fogle's home was raided, and guess what they found? A ton of CP. On the same day that his home was raided, Subway severed all ties with Jared, and some new disturbing facts came to light during the trial. Apparently, years prior, Jared had been texting a Subway franchisee named Cindy, and over these texts, he talked about wanting to abuse kids aged 9 to 16. He told Cindy she should sell herself for sex on Craigslist, and even asked her to arrange a sexual meetup between him and her 16-year-old cousin. Eventually, Jared pled guilty to possession of CP and traveling to conduct an illicit sexual behavior with a minor. Apparently, while in New York City, he paid to have sex with a 17-year-old girl. But this story isn't over yet. I'm going to post part 2, and it definitely gets more interesting from here on out.
I'm calling this the most horrific fraternity hazing ever in the United States. This is how one night at university can destroy your life forever. Danny Santulli was 18 years old and a freshman at the Uni of Missouri. In October 2021, Danny was captured on CCTV being blindfolded and led downstairs in an event named Pledge Dad Reveal Night. Danny was made to drink a litre of straight vodka by himself. At around 10:55, Danny collapsed and some of the frat members were seen carrying him to a sofa. Around midnight, Danny was captured on cameras sliding off the sofa, and shortly after he was found unconscious with blue lips. Shockingly, instead of calling an ambulance for Danny, the frat members piled him into a car, dropping him on the way. They drove him to hospital, but at this point he was already in cardiac arrest. Danny had to be resuscitated and spent the next 6 weeks in intensive care. Prior to this evening, Danny had been left needing stitches and crutches after he'd been forced to climb inside of a bin with broken glass inside. 2 nights before the night in question, Danny broke down in tears on the phone to his sister and told her about how stressed he felt about it all. His family had begged him to quit the pledge, but he didn't want to be ridiculed. This is Danny now. He will need full-time care for the rest of his life. He's now severely brain damaged, is blind, and cannot walk or talk. 2 former students are set to go to trial over this case.
This pedophile was so terrible that when he was released from prison, they actually put out a public safety warning, warning people to stay away from this guy. This is James Alfred Cooper, who Canadian officials nicknamed the worst pedophile in Canadian history. So back in 1903, James was convicted of the brutal essays and torture of 6 children in Canada. And apparently he had used a number of torture devices to keep these kids from talking. He had used a cat o' nine tails, a cow whip, a cattle prod, belts, and sticks. I mean, 6 victims, they all went through so much, and this guy was responsible for all of it. James's background is shrouded in mystery. Nobody knows too much about what he went through as a kid, but he was convicted of assault when he was 22 years old back in 1958, and years later, his criminal career started out with burglary. So at first, when he would break into houses, he would just steal things for the thrill of it. He would take family photos, he would take fridge magnets, items from the kitchen, but that evolved into him wanting to wake up the people that he was robbing. He would stand over these people's beds, wake them up violently in the middle of the night, and then escape out of a window or through the door that he broke in through. But that evolved into a desire to SA people inside of their own homes. At one point, he SA'd a minor in their own home at knife point after waking them up in the middle of the night. He also did the same thing to a single mother while holding her at knife point. I mean, this guy was terrible, and it would only get worse. At one point, though, he married a woman named Patricia, who already had 3 kids. He would eventually have another child with her, and this is when the abuse of children began. And this is when the abuse really started. He would use these horrific tools to actually torture and abuse the children that were living under his own roof. And he did these mind games with the kids. He even made them eat things like their own excrement out of their pants while everybody in the house watched. I mean, this guy was sick and twisted. I mean, there's so much to the story that is so graphic and disturbing that I cannot talk about it here on TikTok. If you want to look it up, there's a great article online that explains this whole case, and it's just really hard to get through. But he would even do things like buy tubs of ice cream, rub it on his body, and make his children lick it off of him. He even at one point invited a neighborhood girl over with one of his own children, and he essayed both of them. Keep in mind, this whole time he was also physically abusing the children, beating them. He was verbally abusing them. He was just the worst person. I can't even get that across how bad of a guy this dude was. Eventually, though, in 1987, he finally was arrested and charged with doing all of these horrible things. Eventually, DNA would link him to some of the break-ins that he had committed as well, and the assaults that he had committed during those break-ins. And at the time, he was given a 30-year sentence. Now, that doesn't sound like very much, but in Canada, that was the longest sentence ever given in Canadian history for crimes like this. But unfortunately, with Canada's laws, this meant that he didn't have to serve that much time for what he had done to his own children, to all of these kids for so many years, to all the random people he had victimized during the break-ins. And in 2012, he was allowed to walk free from prison after only serving 21 years. He was paroled out. And that's what led the Toronto Police Department, like I said at the beginning, to release a public safety warning, warning people that this guy was out of prison, he was walking amongst them, and that they didn't know what he was going to do next. So at the end of the day, if his sentences would have been imposed consecutively instead of concurrently, he would have been in prison for 180 years, meaning he would have died in prison. But since they don't do that in Canada, he only ended up serving those 21 years. Now, there is a little silver lining. Shortly after his release, he was rearrested for breaking the terms of his parole. And at the time he was on chemical castration drugs, he was actually urging his doctor to give him less of them. But since he was a first-time offender, as they called him back in '93 when he was sentenced, he was released shortly after violating the terms of his parole, and once again, he is somewhere out in Canadian society doing God knows what. I just thought I should make this TikTok to let you guys know that he is out there, and he's dangerous. He is a terrible human being. I'm urging you, if you want to read more about this case, to look up the news article. It is one of the most disgusting things I've ever read, and yeah, this guy is really worst of the worst. I can't think of a worse individual than this guy.
Imagine getting married only to be decapitated by your husband 3 months later. 21-year-old couple Jared and Angie got married in October 2022. Around 4 p.m. on the 11th of January, police were called to their home in Texas. Police made a grim discovery in the pair's bathroom after finding, quote, what appeared to be the head of the victim to be in the shower, end quote. Angie's body was discovered on the floor near the bed in a pool of blood with multiple stab wounds to her back. It was actually Jared's poor parents that initially made this discovery after entering the home. They then obviously alerted police to what they found. Jared was arrested and has confessed to killing his wife with a kitchen knife. Jared was actually captured on CCTV, casually stealing a bottle of beer from Angie's workplace just minutes after it's believed that he killed her. Angie's friends have reported to police that the couple's relationship was toxic and Jared was very controlling. Jared's bond is currently set at $500,000.